over 12 kilometers deep into the Earth's interior, drilled for over 25 years, then suddenly sealed off. What incredible discoveries did the scientists make down there? Be sure to stick around until the end, because this story is absolutely fascinating. Welcome, everyone. A race to the center of the Earth sounds like something out of a Jules Verne novel, but it was actually real. While the US and the Soviet Union were battling for supremacy in space during the 1960s, another, far less well-known race was raging at the same time. Who can go deeper into the Earth's interior? If fascinating stories about engineering feats excite you as much as they do me, then go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. It costs nothing, you won't miss any more videos, and you'll be helping me out enormously. Thanks a lot, everyone! Let's start with a mega project that literally goes deep. For on the Kola Peninsula in the far north of Russia, not far from the Norwegian border, Soviet scientists drilled a hole for over 2 decades. Today, all that remains here is an unassuming manhole cover. But beneath it lies something immense, the Kola Superdeep Borehole. 12,262 meters deep, the deepest hole ever drilled into the Earth by humans. To put that into perspective, if you stacked Mount Everest and Mount Fuji on top of each other and buried them in the ground, you'd reach a depth similar to that of the Kola Superdeep Borehole. It's actually nominally deeper than the Mariana Trench, with a diameter about the size of your hand. Imagine that, a wafer-thin hole reaching kilometers into the Earth like a tiny pinprick in the skin of our planet. Why did the Soviets even begin drilling at this exact location in 1970? The Kola Peninsula offers direct access to the Earth's oldest rocks. Normally, these ancient rocks are buried under kilometers thick layers of younger sediments. But here on the Kola Peninsula, rocks over 2 billion years old lie exposed. The project began in May 1970 with ambitious goals. The researchers wanted to drill at least 15 kilometers deep to unlock the secrets of the Earth's crust. They wanted to understand how our planet is structured, how earthquakes occur, and whether there might even be life down there. The first few years of drilling actually went quite smoothly. By 1975, after 5 years of drilling, they had already reached 7 kilometers. During this scientific drilling, the researchers had to carefully extract rock samples without damaging them. This process is called coring, and it is incredibly time-consuming. But the effort was worth it, because what the scientists found at these depths turned some previous theories on their head. First, the expected Conrad discontinuity, that is, the transition from granite to basalt, simply did not exist. Based on seismic measurements, geologists had firmly expected to find this transition, but the rock behaved quite differently than expected. Even crazier was the second discovery, water, and that at depths of 6 to 7 kilometers where there shouldn't actually be any water. Not just a few drops, but actual water-bearing cracks and fissures in the rock. The researchers suspected that the extreme pressure at these depths had forced the water out of the rock's crystal lattices. The absolute highlight was yet to come: fossils. At a depth of 7 kilometers, the scientists found microscopic fossils of single-celled marine organisms, and these little guys weren't just old, they were ancient, 2 billion years old. 24 different species were identified, proving that even at these extreme depths, under these conditions, biological material can remain preserved for billions of years. But as exciting as these discoveries were, the biggest challenge still lay ahead for the engineers, because the deeper they drilled, the hotter it got, and much hotter than expected. Up to a depth of about 3 kilometers, everything matched the predictions. But then, things got really bad. At a depth of 12 kilometers, they measured temperatures of 180 degrees Celsius, nearly twice as high as the expected 100 degrees. Why was that a problem? At such temperatures, rocks suddenly behave very differently, much softer. At the same time, its density also increases. For the drilling equipment, this was a disaster. The drill bits wore out much faster, and the borehole itself was constantly in danger of closing up under the enormous pressure. Then, in 1984, the drilling disaster struck. At a depth of 12 kilometers, the drill string snapped. Over 5 kilometers of drill pipe simply had to be cut off and left behind in the depths. The engineers had no choice but to start over at 7 kilometers and drill a so-called sidetrack, essentially a second attempt. 5 years later, in 1989, they reached the magical mark of 12,262 meters. To this day, that remains the deepest point ever drilled. But the combination of extreme heat, technical problems, and financial and political difficulties following the collapse of the Soviet Union made further drilling impossible. Work was suspended in 1992 and the facility was permanently sealed in 2005. Today, all that remains are the ruins and this rusty cover, but the scientific findings are worth their weight in gold. We had to completely revise our models of temperature distribution within the Earth. We now know that the Earth's crust is much more permeable than previously thought, and we have learned that even in the most extreme environments, traces of life can be preserved, a finding that is also enormously important for the search for life on other planets. Of course, one question remains: how deep could we really drill if we had the right technology? Theoretically, we would have to drill through the entire Earth's crust, about 30 kilometers, to reach the mantle. But given the temperatures there, estimated at 500 degrees Celsius and higher, we would need entirely new materials and drilling techniques. Currently, for example, the Shenda Take 1 project is underway in China's Taklamakan Desert, where a vertical borehole has reached a depth of 10,910 meters, not only tapping into oil and gas reserves, but also specifically investigating geological structures at depth. Added to this is the Iceland Deep Drilling Project, which is drilling into high-temperature geothermal sources at depths of over 4,000 meters. Every new borehole not only brings us closer to the Earth's mantle, but also requires further technical development. Perhaps one day we'll manage to beat the Soviets' record. Perhaps future generations will laugh at our meager 12 kilometers. The Kola borehole remains an impressive monument to human curiosity and proof that the mysteries of our own planet are at least as fascinating as the vastness of space. Let's now turn to another monumental undertaking, for while the West watched the race to the moon with bated breath and the Apollo missions dominated the headlines, the Soviet Union already had an even more ambitious goal in its sights: Mars, the red planet, our enigmatic neighbor in space. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Soviets sent one mission after another to Mars. What the Soviet engineers and scientists accomplished and endured back then is truly remarkable. The first steps toward the red planet were anything but easy. As early as October 1960, the Soviet Union ventured into its first launch attempts. 2 probes were supposed to fly to Mars, but both times the rockets failed. The spacecraft didn't even reach Earth's orbit. The first real breakthrough came in 1962 with Mars 1. The probe launched on November 1st and was technically impressive. Weighing just under 900 kilograms, it was equipped with a camera system and a UV spectrograph. After launch, the engineers discovered that the pressure in the fuel tanks had dropped to 0. A valve had not been closed properly, and at first this did not seem to be a problem. As long as the probe was close enough to the Sun, its gyroscopes could stabilize it. But the farther Mars 1 moved away from the Sun, the less power the solar cells provided. On March 21st, 1963, 106 million kilometers from Earth, contact was finally lost. The probe passed Mars 3 months later in silence and without any means of communication. The 1960s were marked by further setbacks. In 1969, 2 new Mars probes were scheduled to launch, this time using the significantly more powerful Proton rocket, which could carry over 3,800 kilograms into space. But both launches failed catastrophically. In one case, the rocket exploded at an altitude of just 50 meters, and the launch site was contaminated with toxic propellants for months. But then finally, in 1971, came a ray of hope. Mars 2 and Mars 3, 2 identical probes each with a launch mass of 4,650 kilograms, actually reached the red planet in 1971. They were the heaviest spacecraft the Soviets had ever sent to Mars, and each carried a lander weighing about 450 kilograms. What made them special was that these landers carried small Prop M-type rovers on board, which were designed to deploy autonomously. They were equipped with a 15-meter-long cable for data transmission, but here too, fate intervened in an unfortunate way. On Mars 2, the automatic control system failed. The lander entered the atmosphere at too steep an angle and presumably crashed near the Martian mountain range Hellespontus Montes. Mars 3, on the other hand, actually succeeded. The probe landed on the edge of the Ptolemy crater and began transmitting an image. Mars 3 was thus the first successful soft landing on Mars in human history, but after only 20 seconds, the lander fell silent. Scientists suspect that a massive global dust storm raging on Mars at the time crippled the electronics. This was both frustrating and fascinating because Mars 3 transmitted this image. To this day, there is debate over whether we are actually seeing the Martian dust storm here or just radiostatic. The Mars 2 and 3 orbiters did reach their orbits, but things didn't go smoothly there either. The cameras recorded images on film, but before the dust storm subsided, the dust particles had already exposed the film. Nevertheless, some images from the Mars 3 orbiter do exist. On the left, we see the Martian atmosphere clearly defined, and on the right, some mountainous regions near the Martian equator. Sure, a lot of details aren't visible, but remember, these images are from 1971 and were sent back to Earth from a distance of many millions of kilometers. And then there's this shot of Mars from a greater distance, taken by the Mars 3 orbiter. On the right is the original, on the left the colorized version. In 1973, the Mars 4 through 7 missions followed. These missions were intended to carry out a successful Mars landing before the American Viking probes, but the timing was unfavorable. Mars wasn't in an optimal position relative to Earth, the probes had to be lighter, and then a technical disaster struck. A few months before launch, engineers discovered that transistors in the power supply had corroded. The manufacturer had replaced gold with aluminum. Switching production would have taken 6 months, so the launch was postponed to 1975. But political leadership decided otherwise. The probes were to fly anyway, with only a 50% chance of success. And it turned out as it had to. Mars 4 reached Mars, but the electronics had already failed. Mars 5 successfully entered orbit and delivered about 100 photos, but then also failed. Mars 6 managed to jettison its lander, which even took measurements until touchdown. Presumably, however, it crashed on the surface. And Mars 7? The lander was jettisoned 4 hours too early and flew past Mars at a distance of 1,300 kilometers. 4 missions, 4 failures. Of the 14 probes launched, only Mars 5 was a relative success. Further attempts followed later, Phobos 1 and 2 in 1988, which were intended to study the Martian moon Phobos. Phobos 1 was lost en route. Phobos 2 reached Mars' orbit but failed before it could deploy the lander. Nevertheless, the Phobos 2 mission captured impressive images of the Martian moon. Phobos has a diameter of only about 22 kilometers. Navigating to it so precisely and capturing images of it was therefore a major challenge. In some photos of the Martian surface taken by Phobos 2, we can even see the elongated shadow of Phobos. In 1996, Mars 96 failed at launch, and in 2011, long after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian mission Phobos Grunt was launched, a space probe that never made it beyond Earth's orbit and eventually crashed. Mars is and remains incredibly difficult to reach. More than half of all Mars missions, not just the Soviet ones but worldwide, have failed. The Red Planet has truly earned its reputation as a space graveyard. The Soviet engineers and scientists had courage and vision. They attempted things that were technically at the limits of what was feasible, and often went beyond them. But space travel is brutal. One small mistake, a corroded transistor, a valve left open, and years of work are for nothing. But as we all know, we learn best from our mistakes, and even though the Soviets had only limited success on Mars, they taught humanity valuable lessons. Today's Mars missions by NASA, the ESA, China, and others benefit from these early, often painful experiences. The missions provided the first real measurement data on the Martian atmosphere, dust storms, and the extreme conditions during entry, descent, and landing. Above all, the brief but historic successes of Mars 3 demonstrated just how critical weather electronics and redundancy are on Mars. These insights were directly incorporated into later landing concepts. Many of today's standards, from more robust onboard computers to better dust and thermal protection systems, also emerged as a consequence of these Soviet failures. But not all Soviet experiments were carefully planned and thought out. Sometimes they were purely scientific, and sometimes they involved unbelievable coincidences. Just ask yourself this: what happens if you stick your head into a particle accelerator? Something that should never happen. Well, that very bizarre question was answered in dramatic fashion in 1978. That's exactly what happened to Anatoli Bugorski, a Russian physicist who worked at the Institute of High Energy Physics in Prudvino, Russia, then still part of the Soviet Union. The institute had set itself the goal of researching subatomic particles and the properties of nuclear physics, and Bugorski was involved in a special research project focused on the construction of particle accelerators. Particle accelerators are devices that accelerate subatomic particles to high energies in order to study them when they collide with one another, and the results of these collisions can, in the best case scenario, improve our understanding of the fundamental properties of the cosmos. In the late 1970s, Bugorski worked on the largest Soviet particle accelerator, the U-70 synchrotron, which could accelerate protons to energies of up to 76 gigaelectron volts. Definitely a very exciting job. But on July 13, 1978, Bugorski probably would have preferred a little less excitement. Bugorski wanted to investigate a problem with the beam pipe, the tube inside which the particles are accelerated. As he stuck his head into the pipe, the unthinkable happened. A proton beam raced through the pipe and pierced his skull. The reason? Human error. The accelerator was activated by a colleague who also wanted to solve the problem that had prompted Bugorski to stick his head into the tube. What happened to Anatoli Bugorski in that moment? Well, he survived and was therefore able to describe in detail how he perceived the proton beam passing through his brain. According to his own account, he saw a light brighter than 1,000 suns but felt no pain. There were no external injuries either. The proton beam was so high energy that it passed through Bugorski's skull without piercing it. The beam moved through his skull at such a high speed that the damage was concentrated to a very small area, and his outer skin remained largely undamaged. Inside Bugorski's brain, however, the proton beam caused some damage to the tissue and cells. Damage to the nerve fibers controlling his facial muscles led to partial facial paralysis. The proton beam also damaged the nerve cells in Bugorski's ear, which in turn led to persistent tinnitus. But that was it. Bugorski pulled his head out of the steel pipe, his brain pierced by a high-energy proton beam, and the only after effects were partial facial paralysis and tinnitus. Given what happened, one really has to call this a blessing in disguise. The proton beam could have caused his death or serious injuries. His luck, however, was that the beam traveled through his brain so quickly and with such high energy that major damage was avoided. The beam penetrated the back of Bugorski's head, passing through the occipital and temporal lobes of his brain and his left middle ear, and exited through the left side of his nose. These parts of his head received a radiation dose of 200,000 to 300,000 Roentgens. The average annual radiation exposure for us is normally only 0.3 Roentgens. The proton beam passing through Bugorski's brain triggered a cascade of events that led to inflammation of the affected brain tissue. To this day, no one knows how he survived. Dr. David Brenner, head of the Department of Radiation Biology at Columbia University Medical Center, says, "The brain is a very delicate structure, and when exposed to high doses of radiation, it can suffer severe damage. A radiation dose as high as the one Bugorski received should normally have been fatal. The speed of the beam, the precise angle of entry, the exact neural region that was penetrated, and his brain's strong regenerative capacity were likely optimal. If just one small variable had been even slightly different, Anatoli Bugorski would be dead today." That's right, he's still alive and is now 83 years old. His life expectancy was apparently not affected by the incident, not least because of this accident. Safety precautions at particle accelerators are much stricter today. At facilities like CERN in Switzerland, the beam pipes are much better shielded and the safety protocols are far stricter. In addition, there are so-called beam dumps where in emergency situations, the energy of the protons is safely converted into thermal energy of up to 800 degrees. As tragic as Anatoli Bugorski's story is, it has taught us a great deal about the effects of high-energy radiation on the human brain, and has significantly improved safety measures in particle accelerators. I hope you've now gained some insight into the world of Soviet megaprojects. I'll keep you updated here on the channel with many more crazy stories from the world of science. So if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and give us a thumbs up. And now let's turn our attention to an exciting weather phenomenon currently unfolding in Europe. A massive cloud from the Sahara has made its way over to us and is turning the sky red. Thousands of tons of Saharan dust are floating over Europe, causing fascinating phenomena like blood rain and even so-called sundogs. To learn everything about this exciting encounter between Africa and Europe, see the spectacular original images, and understand how this phenomenon even occurs, be sure to click on the video displayed in the top right corner. As always, you'll find another video about science and space in the bottom right corner. Otherwise, I'd say see you in the next video. Take care, everyone.